axis concept is it's newer in the realm of everything gut. As it did start, it was all about digestive health, and the microbiome and the gut immune axis came in, and then the gut brain axis came in. And for me, I always look at these things from a 30,000 foot satellite view. And this is what one of my mentors taught me. He's like, look at it from a satellite view, then go down into the microscopic view and look at the key mechanisms that are taking place in the smallest a detail as you can, because you can only truly understand them holistically when you look at both vantage points. So for me, I look at this stuff and like, this is not separate from the microbiome. This is not separate from the gut immune axis. I mean, you could also make the argument it's not even separate from the digestive process, because the fats we consume, the nutrient, the cofactors, the essential micronutrients that we basically break down and assimilate from our diet eventually become the structural tissue that forms our brain, our spinal cord, the myelin sheath that covers certain neurons. So the idea of the gut-brain axis is just another, I think it's a good way to look at it, is the humans are the most intricately, beautifully designed technology that exists on the planet. And it just goes to show you how interconnected this machine that we all own is. So this is more of a crash course. It would not be well served to try to cover every element of the gut-brain axis in an hour. I don't think it could be done. So I want to give everyone a little bit of a background to basically understand that the nervous system, in my opinion, next to the immune system, is probably the most complex and incredibly designed system in our body, because it essentially facilitates the communication between the brain and the surrounding body systems, but also our entire organism. So it does have specific branches that are responsible for different functions. We have the autonomic nervous system, the one that is functioning in the background that we're not necessarily aware of while I'm talking. If you've eaten lunch, food is moving through your GI system with rhythmic muscular contraction called peristalsis. And then there's our somatic nervous system, which is when you start to get bored of what I'm saying, you start to fidget in your chair, maybe you scratch your eye, or whatever voluntary contractions you have control over. Those are part of the peripheral nervous system. So think of it this way. The central nervous system is the command center, brain and spinal cord. The subsystem would be the peripheral nervous system, which basically is all the nerves and ganglia and nervous tissue outside of the brain and spinal cord. And as I said, they're kind of subdivided into the somatic and autonomic, and further subdivided into the ones that most people reference when they talk about the nervous system. There's the sympathetic nervous system response and the parasympathetic nervous system response, or as I like to call it, the yin and yang of the nervous tissue. When most people talk about nervous system issues, they're talking about a concept called sympathetic dominance, which basically means that something is keeping the body stuck in a state of fight or flight. When it comes to balance, we want to be able to access fight or flight if we need to, if we have a reason to raise stress hormones and run for our lives. We want that ability, but we also want to be able to stimulate the rest and digest branch, which is essentially the communication pathway of the vagus nerve, which extends down from the brainstem, controlled by our hypothalamus, and innervates all the digestive organs all the way down. The final layer is the enteric nervous system, which is likely composed of about 70 to 80 billion neurons, that is essentially located entirely in our GI system. And what's really cool is if you cut the connection between the brain and spinal cord and the enteric nervous system, which is the vagus nerve, it could still function all on its own. They've proven it in animal models that it has enough intelligent wisdom in and of itself to do things like regulate localized blood flow, peristalsis, mucosal secretions and transport. Even the immune and the endocrine receptors in the enteric nervous system can function all autonomously within that group. However, we want the chain of command always to have a sense of what's going on so they can initiate necessary actions when something goes wrong locally. One thing that I think is really interesting, and it fits into this whole gut-brain axis, and I'm going to pose a question to everyone. Does anyone know the only organ in the body that has sympathetic innervation, but that does not have parasympathetic innervation? I'll repeat the question. What's the only organ in the body that has only a sympathetic nervous innervation?
Heart?
Nope. Two more guesses. If the sympathetic is fight or flight, what's the most commonly associated organ with fight or flight?
The adrenal.
There you go. The adrenal glands are the only system in the body that has no parasympathetic innervation from an organ perspective. And that's a big part about why most people today have a commonly disrupted gut-brain axis, because you think of the common state of the average person in the Western world, they're not able to access parasympathetic because there's a concept in the nervous system that neurons that fire together wire together. So the better you get at activating stress response, the more efficient that fight or flight stress response becomes, and the easier it is to raise stress and adrenal hormones. So this is how I like to frame the whole thing. We have the top-down communication. So if you look on the left-hand side, this is our satellite perspective. We see the central command center of the central nervous system gives direction to the autonomic nervous system, which is the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches, which innervate and kind of coordinate traffic with the enteric nervous system. That's the one that's interlaced within the actual muscular lining of the GI system. And what the enteric nervous system regulates, as you can see the last level down there, is all the localized functions that are supposed to take place in the gut. On the right-hand side, you can see it's quite an intricately designed scenario. So the green and the black and the red wires are all the intersegmented communication. What I mean by intersegmented is those are the communication pathways that are going back and forth within the gut. But if you look on the left-hand side, the dotted line is going back to the central nervous system. It basically shows you that things are always being monitored over to make sure that there's no reason to sound the alarm, because that's one of the main functions of our nervous system, specifically sympathetic nervous system, is to interpret sensory inputs that can potentially be a signal of danger or something that will provide harm to our bodies. So that's what we're really looking at. And then this is how I would frame the whole thing is, the nervous system is always sending and receiving messages to interpret the world inside and outside of us. And the very important thing is we used to think it was only a one-way communication. We would think that the brain was the command center. It would send all the signals down to the GI system, and the GI system would just simply take direction and just follow what it's told to do. However, we've now found out that via the vagus nerve, that in and of itself is a two-way communication pathway. So signals can come from the brain down the vagus nerve to influence changes in how your GI system functions. But via the vagus nerve, an example would be that bacterial metabolites can actually travel signals up the vagus nerve back to the brain to send communication signals back and forth. So it's really the concept of what's called a crosstalk. And the main modes of communication, besides the vagus nerve transmission, is also the sympathetic nervous system via the HPA axis, and that's the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And that's one of the fastest systems in our body. And an example would be is if you've eaten something and then you come across a very stressful insult directly in front of you, I find it hilarious that everything in your body tightens, but your bowels loosen upon receiving stress. And that's because digestion under the conditions of stress is an impedance. So one thing I'm trying to tie back here is what I just said. If most people in the Western world are chronically sympathetically driven, then if digestion itself is a parasympathetic response, you can see why most people are walking around with some state of compromised digestive capability, which means they have some degree of compromised GI function, and thus absorption, fermentation, all of these necessary processes that we relate to a healthy gut and a healthy microbiome are chronically being compromised. And if you look at the right-hand side, you can see that if there's issues from the gut-brain axis bidirectionally, we can see psychological disorders, behavior, issues with cognition, anxiety is a common one, even autism, and visceral pain is a concept called central sensitization. And this is a lot of what's at play in people with chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, where the nociceptors in their brain, which is the interpretation signal of pain, for lack of a better description, because of the chronic brain inflammation, are so wound tight that the pain response is magnified, and it's basically a small stimulus can result in a massive amount of pain. And then you look at some of the other issues, neuroendocrine systems, the immune systems, it's the communication between these systems that get eventually disrupted. And it can be also down in the GI system where you see things like IBS, IBDs, infections and whatnot, because the entire communication pathway has been disrupted from a chronic subclinical inflammatory imbalance. I'll say that again. The entire communication pathway between the gut, the brain, the immune system becomes dysregulated because something under the surface is chronically imbalanced and the body can no longer find normal function, whatever that means. So when it comes to the gut-brain axis, we use a lot of different common compounds in the body you'll find elsewhere. You'll see neurotransmitters. So the gut, just like the brain, will use things like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and GABA. And neurotransmitters are typically synthesized by bacteria when they have access to specific amino acids. But if you change the composition of the bacteria, you can change the ability to synthesize certain neurotransmitters, which will influence local activity in the gut, which will have a systemic influence over mood, brain performance, and the overall functions and the communications between all the branches of the nervous systems. Same thing with metabolites or things like postbiotics. Short-chain fatty acids, when in an optimal profile, can signal the brain and enhance things like satiety, insulin sensitivity, blood sugar regulation. But when they're problematic, they can actually cause issues with things like leptin resistance or drive up blood sugar, or drive up triglycerides, all because the metabolites being created in the gut have an influence over that gut-brain axis. Another one are gases, things like hydrogen, hydrogen sulfide, and methane. Methane, for example, is really implicated, and I have a slide coming up in this, in IBS. So high amounts of methane can actually shut down peristalsis and cause immune suppression, and the resulting IBS-like symptoms people experience in some cases, not every case, can be as a result of excessive methane production. And then there's hormones. Hormones, as I mentioned, are really tied closely to the HPA axis. So excessive amounts of cortisol that is being released for whatever reason will influence the bacterial makeup and activity. Also, the manifestation of these things called enteroendocrine receptors. So the receptors in the gut that respond to the specific hormones being released. Hormones can influence biofilm growth, and excessively, they can alter things like host resistance, the state of the immune system. Is it hyper-inflammatory or is it stuck in loss of regulation? And also virulence factors of pathogens and parasitic infections. So I think this last point is really important. Environmental stress and pro-inflammatory cytokines are the major drivers of endocrine release and thus likely have a large influence over the microbiome in an inside to outside philosophy. Said differently, it likely does start with some kind of disruption that's driving an inflammatory response in the gut that ends up dysregulating the communication to maintain balance in the gut-brain axis. If you're dysbiotic, if you don't digest food well, it's a matter of time before that gut-brain communication becomes compromised or in some cases severed. And it really comes back to this simple concept. You know, the modern human lifestyle is opposite of a monk who meditates 4 hours a day. Because things like meditation, deep breathing, those are parasympathetic activities. Being stuck in traffic, losing your cell phone, eating on the run, you know, having your kids fight. These are sympathetically driven activities, but we don't realize that it's an insidious thing. It's like, you know, water washing up on a shore slowly erodes the landscape over centuries. It doesn't happen in a day. The same kind of concept can be applied to the dysregulation of the gut-brain axis. And I found this really cool. I looked at some specific species of bacteria, and you can see how they're all very much playing an important role in synthesizing specific compounds. So if someone doesn't have a good profile of lactobacillus, that might change acetylcholine and GABA production in the gut. Same with bifidobacterium. E. coli produce some of the, dopamine, epinephrine neurotransmitters. And if they're not in good balance with some of the others, maybe there's going to be a deficiency there. Streptococcus and enterococcus can help produce serotonin. Bacillus species also produce norepinephrine and dopamine. So knowing this, dysbiosis influencing things like microbial distribution and composition will ultimately influence these metabolites being produced and thus will alter the path of signaling. And an example is if 95% of serotonin is produced in the GI system, what the changes in serotonin metabolism mean for the function of the GI tract. And that could be a multitude of things locally to the GI tract, typically relating back to how food moves through the GI system and the regulation of peristaltic action. But it could also influence mood because serotonin does have an influence over things like state of happiness, satisfaction, so on and so forth. So on the experiential side, if you're a doctor or a nutritionist or a chiro or whoever, what are your patients going to be experiencing? Well, there's influence over the emotional states. So behavior, mood, and emotional regulation are going to be the things that are going to be compromised. So people will have snap mood changes. They'll have things that relate to anxiety or fear. They could have obsessive compulsive behaviors, and in extreme cases, things like autism-like or Asperger's presentation. So we know that the emotional state can be influenced, but so can the cognitive state. Short-term memory, learning capabilities, executive function, anything in the prefrontal cortex that can be traced back to what would be an experience of brain fog will have an influence over what's going on in the gut, or rather what's going on in the gut will have influence over those aspects. And there's alterations of communication in the peripheral nervous system. I've seen this happen with athletes. When they don't have a healthy functioning GI system, their bodies don't move the same. Their muscles can't coordinate contraction the same way. They don't have that uniqueness that allows them to be the elite athlete, because a lot of that really is intertwined in how their nervous system is made up. And then if you look in the gut, every aspect of gut function that becomes compromised, meaning secretions, peristalsis, immune response, everything as a result of an negatively influenced gut-brain axis will change. And I found these two specific examples of implications quite interesting. So we know that IBS is often the expression of, as I said, methane in the gut with accompanied immune suppression and alterations in GI motility. And IBS is what's called a functional motility disorder. And I don't want to call it a cop-out, but when someone doesn't actually have a way of determining on a lab test what client is experiencing in the GI system, there's no immune proteins active, there's no inflammation, there's no blood in the stool, but something's not right. They just go, you, sir or madam, have IBS. And it really is the job of whoever actually becomes the Sherlock Holmes to reverse engineer the problem. Oftentimes, it's a combination of gut immune and gut brain disruption. The second I found really interesting because, Jeff, this will hit home with you because you and I share the same thing, a father with an affliction. Research has shown that in animal models, there's a buildup of this alpha-synuclein protein in the gut and then the brain that precedes the development of Alzheimer's and also Parkinson's disease. So basically what happens is you get this protein that accumulates in the gut. It can influence and alter signaling, and the bacterial metabolites and the short chain fatty acids produced can get into the bloodstream, induce neuroinflammation, which will induce brain inflammation, compromise motor function, and ultimately lead to a pathological manifestation of some kind of neurological or neurodegenerative disease. So it does show you the changes in composition of the gut will result in changes in signaling. And when that is potentially pathogenic, it is always accompanied with an inflammatory response. So I'm trying to sell you guys on this idea that everything here that we talk about with the GI system, it's always interconnected. And when it comes to highlighting the area of focus, it's being able to draw and make connections that really is the important thing. So here's an example of what happens in any kind of brain inflammation. So you have things starting in the GI system. You have dysbiosis, you have things like lipopolysaccharides and short chain fatty acids and other leaky gut-like secretions getting out of the GI system into the general circulatory system, driving an immune response. So it means that we have altered permeability at the gut level. That immune response is going to systemically circulate. And if it's problematic enough, and I have a really interesting slide coming up, it will show changes in the blood-brain barrier, because there is actually a very closely tied physiologic connection between the cells that hold our GI system together and the cells that hold the selectively permeable barrier around the brain called the blood-brain barrier together. So if these inflammatory cytokines and activated immune cells are taking place in the hippocampus of the brain, you can see that they're driving what's called the microglia activation, which these are the immune cells of the brain that essentially are driving this inflammatory cytokine release, which then will alter how neurons function. And as a protective mechanism, the brain will build up these pro-inflammatory or these resulting inflammatory proteins. They're called, tau proteins and various other beta amyloid plaques, and that will alter brain function. And then as a result, you will also have an alteration of how the vagus nerve communicates from the brain down to the gut. And now you have this compromised feedback loop that is always being driven unless we intervene somehow. If we look at a more specific micro level, as I mentioned before, the immune cells of the brain and the microglia outnumber the neurons, probably about like 10-1. So if they're receiving the signal from these pro-inflammatory compounds, they drive up the immune signaling, which basically means, hey guys, there's an inflammation here, let's try to heal. But if it never gets healed because the source of origin never gets taken place, the blood-brain barrier starts to break down and increases its permeability. And then things never meant to get into the brain, which is essentially a big wad of fatty tissue that's very fragile in its nature, start to cross into the brain, and it causes neuroinflammation, synaptic death, neuronal death, and ultimately the development of pathologies of age-associated diseases. And if you have leaky gut, it's almost assured that you probably have leaky brain, because the tight junctions in the gut have a very similar function to the tight junctions in the brain. And the more you bombard the physiologic barriers in the body, the more they break down, because they're not designed to be chronically bombarded with pro-inflammatory insults. For sake of the presentation, I'm going to send everyone this, so I won't read through the little paragraphs that I put there, but I just find it so easy, not easy rather, so interesting and an easy conversation to go to your doctors and say, hey, well, do you deal with leaky gut? And of course, they're going to say, yeah. It's like, do you deal with leaky brain? It's like, they might go, what are you talking about? Or the ones who are very well informed will know about this. But again, it's a great conversation to get into why digestive health is so important, as Jeff mentioned, but then why the immune health and why brain health and all these things fit in, because it really is a holistic way of taking care of the body. So I wanted to look at, how do we sell this? How do we approach this? And an important perspective is, you want to make sure that you can reverse engineer the system. If something is being driven as a result of an imbalance that leads to permeability, that leads to systemic inflammation, then we do need to find a way to reverse engineer this problem so that the original insult can somehow get alleviated or cleared up. So I came up with the concept of the top-down approach. The top-down is brain down to gut. And we have some brain-specific supplements that are very neuroprotective. But we know that it's typically the bottom-up approach that's probably more likely the source of origin. So how are we supporting all the arms of the GI system and the microbiome? And for me, it's like this. One, if inflammation is the initiation of the healing process, it's trying to protect fragile tissues from being damaged. So we want to reverse engineer that source of inflammation so the body can finally silence it and allow healing to happen. So once we rebuild the compromised system, we've cleaned up someone's gut, we've restored their digestion, we've silenced the immune system, we've got them back to baseline. And when they're back to baseline, we don't want them to be so fragile that they just revert back to being sick. We want to induce what's called a stress tolerance. So imagine if someone has a 1-pound barrel, it can hold 1 pound of liquid. If you pour 2 pounds of liquid in that 1-pound barrel, they're in a big heap of trouble. So if we can increase their barrel to 5 pounds of tolerance, then their GI system is a lot more able to withstand being broken down. So if we enhance each system in the body along the way, it can sustain and maintain health. And then we get to the concept of maintenance as progress, and I'll explain what I mean. Jeff and I were talking about the idea of, well, people should stay on supplements long-term because you got to maintain this. And I'll say, yeah, our world and environment is likely going to push us to being sick if we don't do something about it. So if in 5 years you've aged, you've lived in the Western world, and you're still healthy, you can see it as, I haven't gotten sick, so I've maintained my health, but you've actually made progress because the world is actually kind of working against you based upon how we've constructed our modern society. So based upon the promotion, our top-down products are Sun Balance and Sun Theanine. And the little elevator pitch is, if you have leaky brain, well, these products are going to help protect the neurons from inflammatory insult. So the antioxidants and the PEA are actually going to help protect the neurons from those pro-inflammatory cytokines. And the theanine is going to find the yin to the yang of the excitatory to inhibitory neurotransmission. Basically, when we have too much glutamate, that burns out neurons. It's too much stimulation. It's like putting a very powerful light bulb in a socket and keeping it on all the time. We want to be able to turn that light socket off occasionally so we save on our electricity bill. And that's where Sun Theanine comes in, as we've discussed in previous months. And then from the bottom up perspective, we know Sun Spectrum is an incredible fiber with added anti-inflammatory support from things like CoQ10, curcumin, things of that nature. So we have anti-inflammatory herbal supplements and nutrients, in addition to the fact that we can support the production of things like butyrate and the short chain fatty acids that regulate the anti-inflammatory activity both locally in the gut and butyrate has a potential beneficial systemic effect. So this is the 5-step process that I think we can take the products that are on promotion, but then expand the whole concept to selling a solution for a doctor. Number one, you want to ensure digestion. If you don't have strong digestion, nothing else matters. It's a matter of time before you're dysbiotic or before your gut's inflamed or leaky. And, looking at the concept of the gut-brain axis, if we have undigested protein molecules entering the colon, then that's going to drive growth in specific strains of bacteria that are able to modify these amino acids to neuroactive chemicals. So rather than having a deficiency of serotonin or dopamine, maybe we have too much. And that's also something to think about. Then there's addressing systemic inflammation, using specific enzymes on an empty stomach. I'll never forget how Jason sold the idea of Therazyme to me with the different body systems and segments that it works upon. So something like that will be incredibly beneficial to someone who has a really heightened and inflamed gut-brain axis. Then we want to build a healthier profile of microbes. That should be healthier, not health. Looking at all the different probiotics we have, we know if it's a colonic issue, we have True Bifido. If it's a small intestine issue, we have True Flora. If it's a systemic issue, we have Bioenzyme, and we also have Theralac Pro. So we have different opportunities available to us to help, specify where we think the problem is. And if it's something in the colon and someone's looking at neurodegeneration, we have an approach. If it's IBS and it's something in the small intestine, in the stomach, we have an approach. Then there's nourishing the microbiome with all the different fibers and the wonderful research that's come through Tomorrow's Nutrition about sun fiber and all the different fiber supplements that we have. And lastly, we can protect the brain with, the specific nutrients and other enzymes like the Youthzyme and Sulfurazyme and various things that can modulate the pro and anti-inflammatory response. And with that, everyone, I think that's all I got.